Okay, so good morning. Thank you for joining. Sorry if you had trouble logging on, but there's a few of you here now, so hopefully other people will get to listen to this later on. As Linda says, I'm Vicky. I'm one of the partners at Thackeray Williams Solicitors. I head the residential property teams and personally specialise in lease extensions, collective enfranchisements, anything to do with a residential lease, basically. So a topic very close to my heart over the last 7 to 8 years or so has been ground rents. I lobbied my local MP, who was Michael Fallon at the time, a few years back now, to bring the issue of onerous ground rents to the fore. And I'd like to say that that was the start of the government's process into reviewing leasehold reform, but obviously, in all honesty, I'm sure they've got more important people advising them on this topic. But before we discuss what the changes are to ground rents, I think it's important to understand what a rent is and how we've arrived at onerous ground rents being a household term. So Charlie, if you want to go to the first slide, please. The first question is, what is a ground rent? So a ground rent is a payment that is made to the owner of the freehold land on which the property sits. So in other words, a payment to use the actual ground. You should know that maintenance charges for common parts and insurances are paid under service charges and do not form part of ground rents. So historically, under the rents under long leases were minimal, a nominal payment, because the real value was in the actual building, so the premium that you paid to purchase the lease. Over time, some freeholders and some solicitors too have lost sight of legislation on rents that was in place to limit ground rents, and that has partly led to what we now call onerous ground rents being in place. That means where the figure is much more significant than nominal. There's no real definition of what an onerous ground rent is, but some examples are on the next slide, please, Charlie. And they include a double in rent every 10 years, which doesn't sound too much to start with, but in 50, 60 years' time, when that rent has doubled, it can be quite significant. A rent rising above £1,000 in Greater London or £250 elsewhere, or a compounding RPI ground rent. So a number of nationwide developers were using those type of leases. So there's thousands and thousands of these in existence. Mortgage lenders are no longer willing to grant mortgages over leases containing onerous ground rents as set out on that slide. And that has led to a number of leaseholders being trapped, unable to sell their flat or remortgage, and unable to meet the costs to buy out their ground rents. This is the situation that people are now facing, and the government have announced that they are committed to doing something about this to help leaseholders. However, the difficulty remains that the leases do exist, and how can we amend them without affecting the human rights of freeholders, because they've got the benefit of them. The rents can't unilaterally be removed, and freeholders are unlikely to be willing to remove the ground rents out of choice. So here lies the dilemma that the government currently face. So now we get to one of the most significant changes in property law in a whole generation, and it's the first tranche of the government's plan to reform leasehold legislation. If we can go on to the next slide, please, Charlie. The Leasehold Reform Ground Rent Act 2022 came into force on the 30th of June 2022 for most properties. It doesn't take effect for retirement properties before 1st of April 2023. So we're still waiting for a date for retirement properties at the moment. The Act seeks to put an end to ground rents for new qualifying long residential leasehold properties in England and Wales. So that's a lease of more than 21 years granted at a premium. So from that date, 30th June 2022, new ground rents in most new leases can't be anything more than 1 peppercorn per annum. So that means an actual peppercorn, no money can be paid. I was going to bring with me an actual peppercorn because people quite often ask me, what does a peppercorn mean? But it's an actual peppercorn. The Act also bans freeholders from charging administration fees for collecting that peppercorn rent. There's fines of up to £30,000 that could be payable by freeholders where they do charge ground rents disobeying this Act. So freeholders really need to be aware of this legislation. If we can go on to the next slide, we can then see that there are very few exceptions to the Act. So these include applicable community-led housing, certain financial products, business leases, which are defined in the Act as the lease allowing the premises to be used as for business purposes without the need to go back to the freeholder for further consent, provided the use of the dwelling significantly contributes to the business. So, for example, a flat above the shop where the shopkeeper lives in the flat and needs to open the shop at a certain time or close the shop at a certain time. And also provided that at or before the time the lease is granted, the landlord and tenant exchange written notices confirming that the use is for business purposes. Also excluded from the Act are shared ownership leases, where the rent will be more significant. Statutory lease extensions for both houses and flats remain unchanged at the moment, so they're exempt from this Act. A statutory lease extension for a flat does have a peppercorn ground rent in any event, so there's no real problem there. Leases of houses are slightly different. They have a right to a lease extension for 50 years. There's no premium payable for that lease extension, but there will be a rent, and it can be quite significant. And the best bit of advice really is don't entertain a leasehold house. For leaseholders with existing leases who might want to enter into voluntary lease extensions, so they're also known as informal lease extensions, where we haven't served any notice on the freeholder, the current term of the lease may contain the current ground rent, but the extended term must be for a peppercorn ground rent. So as I said, the Act only applies to new leases or documents that take effect as a new lease. So for example, that is a deed of variation of a lease where you're extending the demise or you're extending the term. You just need to be careful that the rent would then be a peppercorn for that extended term. It doesn't prevent anyone from entering into a deed of variation to solely amend the ground rent. And I think if a freeholder is wanting to do that, to increase the ground rent, it's not within the spirit of the legislation, and I think they're likely to receive bad press if that were to get out. So the idea of this Act was to make home ownership fairer and more transparent for future leaseholders. The reputation of the leasehold system has been massively damaged by unfair practices that have seen some leaseholders contractually obligated to pay onerous and escalating ground rents, which has been highlighted in the media. The Act will prevent this from happening in the future, so it tackles unfairness for future leaseholders. As I've alluded to, it does also help out current leaseholders who need to extend their leases, as it means they need to have a peppercorn rent in the future for the extended term, but it can also create some problems for those existing leases. Before this Act came into force, it was very common for informal lease extensions to be entered into, agreed informally between the freeholder and leaseholder. Quite common was the premium being reduced to enable the freeholder to continue to charge a ground rent, and as long as that was a reasonable sum, there was no problem with that lease extension. However, that's not allowed now under this new Act, so it does mean that some leaseholders are now trapped, unable to sell the lease if the term is below 90 years, and unable to afford to extend if the premium is too high with the peppercorn ground rent. I think this is an unintended consequence of the Act. As I said earlier, this is the first tranche of leasehold reform. The government has committed to a comprehensive reform of the leasehold system. A bill on the broader leasehold reform is expected, but with constant changes in government and COVID, this appears to have taken a back seat. And after today, I think the government might have more important things on their plate again. So if we can go on to the next slide, I just wanted to run through some examples of where the government have said they intend to take further steps to make the leasehold system fairer for leaseholders. So I think it's likely to include reforming the process for enfranchisement valuation. This could be by the use of one mutual joint surveyor. At the moment, a leaseholder pays both parties leaseholders fee, both parties valuation fees. So this could be a slight saving for a leaseholder. Another point we think they're going to consider is the abolition of marriage value, which is the biggest cost for lease extensions and could be a topic in itself for another webinar. However, it could be seen to be unfair for freeholders if this is removed, and I'm sure there'll be a human rights challenge from freeholders if that's abolished. The next point is capping ground rents for current leases and prescribing rates for the calculations. We think they're likely to bring out an online calculator to simplify and standardise the process of enfranchisement. The next 2 points I'm not proposing to run through because they're quite technical points, but it's include keeping discounts for improvements made by leaseholders and retaining separate valuation methodology for low value properties. Another point is proposals to give leaseholders of flats and houses the right to extend their leases for 999 years, as often as they wish, with a zero ground rent. Currently, freeholders have redevelopment breaks, and I think that's likely to stay because there needs to be something for freeholders in amongst all of this. Then we've got another couple of ideas we think are enabling leaseholders to buy their rents out. But they might have a high rent, but they don't actually need an extended term. So one way to keep the premium down will be just to buy the rent out and not to extend the term. And the last point the government are intending to do is make the legal process easier to understand and less prescriptive. It means there should be less traps for the leaseholder to fall through, and the whole system should be easier for leaseholders to proceed with. How or even if these items are going to be brought in, we just don't know. We've got some ideas, but a number of them might lead to the process being fairer for the leaseholder, but then unfair for the freeholder, which potentially means the bills don't get passed through the houses. There is speculation that any abolition of marriage value to make the lease extension premium cheaper could be replaced by, in another guise, appearing to be fairer for leaseholders, but actually being more expensive in practice. And we await further information from the government on that. There's also the idea that perhaps common hold could be reintroduced to become an alternative to leasehold interests. And again, that's a whole nother webinar, and I think a lot of lawyers are scared about that process because it's not what we're used to. We'd have to learn a whole new set of legislation. And we do expect that leasehold houses will be abolished. So any leases or any new leases could only be on flats. So the unknown of where leasehold is heading is leading to a deteriorating market in many locations in England. And it's been impacted by mortgage lenders constantly updating their conditions on the length of lease term and the amount of rents that they're willing to lend on. So is this the end of ground rent investments? That's something for us to discuss perhaps at the end. Many pension funds are investing ground rents, and is there an alternative for our pension money? I think that's something that we might need to discuss. So moving on to my last slide, some questions that I thought are likely to get asked, so I thought I'd get in there and answer them first. So what should you do if you've paid a prohibited ground rent? So that's a rent of more than a peppercorn in a lease granted after the 30th of June 2022. The first thing to do is, if you've been wrongly required to pay the rent, you need to speak to the freeholder or the managing agent who's requested it and request that they repay the amount within 28 days of your request. Where a freeholder or the managing agent acting on their behalf doesn't refund it within 28 days, an enforcement authority may investigate and consider taking enforcement action against that person. That could result in the payment being refunded and a penalty against the freeholder of up to £30,000. So the managing agent doesn't get that financial penalty. It would only be the freeholder. So it's really important to know about this legislation if you're a freeholder or if you're a managing agent. You don't want to break those rules. The Act also allows leaseholders to make an application to the Property Tribunal for a recovery order. although each party are responsible for their own costs for making that tribunal hearing. So I think it remains to be seen whether leaseholders actually take that up. So what about administration charges? The Act says you can't charge a fee for collecting a peppercorn ground rent. So a leaseholder is entitled to make an application to the property chamber of the tribunal to contest any administration charges, or for a formal variation of the lease to not allow those charges to be made. I'm not sure that leaseholders will do this in practice, because the costs involved in making that application might outweigh the costs of the administration charge that you're seeking. But what you could do if you're charged frequently is make an application to the tribunal to have another manager put in place who knows the rules and won't be charging you that administration charge. So what should you do if the lease says you have to pay a ground rent that's prohibited? So any leases that were entered into after the 30th of June 2022 can't have a ground rent. If it does say that you have to pay a ground rent, then it's automatically treated as though you don't pay a ground rent, and it's replaced with the peppercorn. And the last point to note is that the enforcement authority can take action against freeholders. They've got financial penalties of between £500 to £30,000 if freeholders charge ground rents in disobeyance of the Act. The enforcement authority can make a recovery order to recover those funds as well, but they can't do that if there's also an application made to the tribunal, and they can't have two recovery orders in place at one time. So just be aware of the Act if you're the freeholder, because you don't want to get caught out and have to pay those penalties. That brings me to the end of everything that I needed to say. I didn't want to make it too long because it can be quite dull talking about ground rents and the new legislation, but if anybody's got any questions, please do fire them at me and I'll see what I can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Vikki. That was really interesting. I was, although I'm not involved in, residential properties, I just found it interesting that they're changing this law after all many years. As you say, it's quite a big change in the law, and there's more to follow by what you were saying. So
definitely,
yeah. Did I miss the bit when you explained what a peppercorn rent was? I know you mentioned it.
Yeah, so a peppercorn rent is an actual peppercorn. I meant to bring one with me so I could show you all an actual peppercorn. Essentially, it's nothing. So you don't pay anything, which is why they brought in the point about administration charges, because I suppose one of the thoughts was, would a managing agent charge a fee to collect that peppercorn even though you're not going to be paying anything? Is that just another way to get around paying a ground rent? So that's one of the reasons why they've abolished or made it illegal to charge an administration fee to collect the peppercorn ground rent.
All right. Oh, thank you. Is there any questions from anybody else on the call?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Hello, sorry, we had a bit of trouble joining. I've got a question for Vikki. It's regarding the cost of extending or a lease. Is that the right expression? Do you extend a lease, or do you renew a lease? Or
we call it extending the lease, because the lease stays in place and then you're just adding a bit onto the end of the term, so extending it in residential properties. Okay, so do you know how do you work out? Is there an easy way of working out the costs involved? No. Okay. Not really. It's quite, and this is one of the points really with the expected reform, because it is complicated. It's a really difficult calculation. There's specialist surveyors who are involved in working out what the premium should be, and a freeholder surveyor will come up with a scale of what they think the premium should be, and then the leaseholder surveyor will come up with another scale of what they think the premium should be. So there's a whole wide range of what we could be saying that the reasonable premium is, and that's why the process is quite convoluted and quite often can go to tribunal for them to determine what the premium should be for the lease extension. There are online calculators that will give you a very rough guide as to what a reasonable premium for the lease extension is. I wouldn't advise anybody to wholly rely on those, and you should always seek specialist surveyors' advice. But if you want a guide, then that would give you a very rough guide as to what the likely costs would be. That's for the premium, and then on top of that, you've got obviously the freeholders' legal fees and the leaseholders' legal fees.
Yeah. Okay. So it's both parties' fees.
Yeah.
You need to.
Leaseholder pays for everything. Yeah.
Okay.
There is a way generally to make it a bit cheaper, and that's to try to agree the terms with the freeholder directly, so you don't have to make a statutory application for the lease extension, and that cuts down the cost slightly because both freeholder and leaseholder solicitors know exactly what's involved, so they can reduce their fees and cap the fees at a reasonable level then.
Okay. Sorry, has anybody else got any questions? Because I just wanted to ask. I've forgotten that one now. No, that's okay. Thank you very much, Vikki.
If you've got any other questions after this, I'm happy to talk about lease extensions for hours. So just drop me an email, and
I'll take you up on that. Thank you.
I'll happily talk to you about it.
Thank you.
Did you put your contact details on a slide?
They were on the last slide, but I didn't actually say there's the last slide. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Maybe we can when all the questions have ended, if you could just, Charlie, put up the very last slide once all the questions are finished, and then give everybody a chance just to take down Vikki's contact details, please.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions really. I suppose the first one is just a clarification. We sort of spoke about, might this be the end of ground rent portfolios, and I assume that's because if you're holding a ground rent portfolio, you're no longer going to get your £50 or your £100 a year from each leaseholder. But you'll still get your premiums, won't you, for extending your leases? So in the long term, the income will be there. It'll just be a lot more lumpy, which isn't a very technical term, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely. You'll still be entitled to the premium for a lease extension, but once you've had that, then there won't be an annual income. It will just be as and when those lease extension premiums come in. Yeah.
And we sort of spoke about new leases from the 30th of June can only be at a peppercorn rent. Is that making? Would you say that will make new leases more attractive to purchasers, or because essentially all the terms in the old leases have been scrapped, it doesn't really make a difference?
I think it is creating a two-tier leasehold system at the minute, because yes, new leases have to be at a peppercorn ground rent and have to be at more than 125 years term. So a brand new lease might be more attractive than a lease that has got £250 rent and reviews every 25 years and only has 90 years left to run, or something like that. So I do think for a bit of time there'll be a two-tier system. New leases will be more attractive, but the old leases, or second-hand leases, once they've been extended, they should be just as attractive as brand new leases. That's the theory behind it.
Okay.
I see Charlie's put up the details. Can everybody see the details? The contact details for Thackeray Williams? Okay, so she's not actually put my email on there. So if I give you that, it's Vikki, which is VIKKI .Herbert HERBERT @thackerayWilliams.com. Then if you have got any questions, just drop me an email and I'll be more than happy to come back to you. Have you got that, Teresa?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I was just writing it down. Thank you very much.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Well, in that case, can I just thank you, Vikki, for your giving up your time and preparing the presentation. It's really insightful, you know, even for a layperson like myself. I think
no problem. I hope you found it interesting, or
I did,
maybe even learned something.
Yes. And now I'm going to go and look up the origins of peppercorn. You know, I'm going to Google that and see why that was introduced. So anyway, can I just say thank you, and to Thackeray Williams very much for your time, as I say, on this subject. This session has been recorded and it will go onto the Chamber website. So if anybody would like to watch it again, or those that maybe that wasn't able to connect, they can actually look at your slides and your questions. So can I say thank you very much to everyone for attending, managed to get in, and to you again, Vikki.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.